Hello, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike McShane. I'm Director of National Research at EdChoice and also an adjunct scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. I'd like to welcome you to our Getting Early Childhood Right webinar. This is a part of a series of webinars that we're doing to dig into some of the lessons learned and some of the topics covered in Rick Hess and my new book, Getting Education Right, A Conservative Vision for Improving Early Childhood, K-12, and College. Just a couple weeks ago, we had a great conversation where we talked to some really thoughtful people from K-12 education. And actually, in just a couple weeks, I'm going to tell you the details at the end of this call, so spoiler alert for the end. But no, we're going to be having a Getting Higher Education Right conversation as well. For those of you that are interested in the book, if you head to the Teachers College Press website and enter the code AEI, you can actually get a 20% discount. So, I mean, look at this. We're a minute into this and we're already saving you money. But if you're interested in the book, Teachers College Press website, you can enter the code AEI to get a 20% discount. You'll also see on the event page for our conversation today, Ilana Oventhal's email address. If you have any questions for the panelists, you can feel free to email those to her. She will be also checking the website formerly known as Twitter. I believe now we are required to call it X, which is a thing. But if you want to tweet to the hashtag Getting ECE Right, so that'd be hashtag Getting ECE Right, she'll also be checking that for questions. I'm really happy today to be joined by our panelists. First off, I'd like to introduce my co-author, Rick Hess. I'm trying to remember where Rick works. Oh yeah, there it is, right behind him. He is the Director of Education Policy Studies at AEI. We also have Emily Ann Gullickson, who's Deputy Secretary of Education for Virginia, a state that's doing some really wonderful and interesting things in this space. We have Celia Hartman Sims, who I think has probably forgotten more about this topic than I know currently. And so we're so happy to have her. She is the president of the Abecedarian group. And last, but certainly not least, we have Patrick Murray, who's the vice president for government affairs of KinderCare Education. I was thinking maybe we'll start by kind of throwing each of you all a question. It'll become potentially more conversational after that. But Emily Ann, I think it would be great to start with you. Maybe if you could give us just a short overview of what you all are doing in Virginia.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mike. So glad to be here with you all. You know, in Virginia, we know families are not one size, and so we don't have a single approach to early childhood learning options. We have a robust public-private birth to five childhood system in Virginia, from home-based providers, public-private, parochial, community partnerships, and more. And we have over 2/3 of our families in Virginia choosing public-private early learning options through some of our programs. So our public investments really focus on our highest need working families and their ability to choose the early learning options that work best for their infant or a young child, and also addressing work-related childcare needs. And in December, Governor Youngkin launched our building blocks for Virginia Families Initiative. We're really codifying dollars following children and meeting parent demand, improving transparency and better parent navigation, getting rid of red tape and bureaucratic hurdles, which I know we'll dig into more later, for both families and for providers to expand our supply of the options families want, and seeding more innovative solutions. So we are thrilled. That's only 3 months in, but seeing a lot with bills on his desk, including ones he signed just this week. So looking forward to explaining more of that later.
Absolutely. Celia, I was wondering if you could chat a bit about the history of early childhood education policy. Where do you think conservatives have gotten it right, and where do you think they might have gotten it wrong?
Thanks so much. And this is one place I actually think we got it right at the beginning in 1990, when we actually created something called the Child Care and Development Block Grant. It was part of a reconciliation bill back in the day. And guess what, conservatives? We created a voucher program, a very robust voucher program that allows parents to choose a provider of their liking. It could be a family child care provider, it could be a center, it could be a religious provider, and that religious provider doesn't even have to hide the cross or the menorah during the hours of care. They could actually be sectarian in what they provide. And they can also choose a family member, be that an aunt or a grandmother, to care for their child. And I think we got it right in 90 with the creation of it. I think where we've gotten it wrong is we've forgotten that we helped create this great voucher program, and now we've got this weird anomaly in like the federal education continuum where K-12 is the non-choice anomaly, bookended by this rich choice on early childhood and the rich choice in the Pell Grant and higher ed system.
Well, I think building off that perfectly, Patrick, for some folks that might be coming to this without as strong of a background, early childhood education has this kind of mixed model of delivery. I wonder if you could maybe kind of explain that to folks, but also maybe some of the threats that are out there to that model, the very model that both Celia and Emily Ann have been talking about.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And thanks to you and Rick for focused on early childhood education in the book. It's an important topic in education generally. It's a topic that conservatives need to be thinking about because it's a growing area of interest in the education policy space. Emily Ann highlighted Virginia's focus on a broad spectrum of providers. That is a mixed delivery system. It's the system that we have. It was a system that was built by private providers getting in and satisfying a need, public schools, Head Start, private providers, nonprofit, for-profit, meeting the needs of parents. And that is a diverse need set that's out there. And the real beauty of that system is it is flexible. It is oftentimes year-round. It is meeting parents' needs early in the day, late in the day. And in communities, sometimes schools need to fit that support or essentially the before and after school care. And sometimes it's a church at the end of the street that can actually do that. The beauty of the mixed delivery system is it is the system we have. The concern is that can we maintain that? And as we have more and more interest in early childhood education, namely pre-K, most of that focus, when we say preschool, folks think that has to occur in a public school. In some places it does. In others, it's actually occurring in a nonprofit childcare center. It's occurring maybe in a family childcare home. There are a number of places childhood education, even preschool, is occurring. And to Celia's point, from a federal government standpoint, we're funding the Child Care and Development Block Grant that enables parents, namely lower income families, to choose the setting that meets their needs most. Families of higher means generally do that out of pocket, but really finding a way to ensure that we're not limiting choice by only focusing on preschool in schools, and then the negative impact that comes from just going with preschool in the public school system. Mike, you said some of the negatives that come from that. Just an example, if in a community that's serving early learners in a diverse group of settings, all of a sudden says we're going to have a public preschool option. It's going to be completely free, but it's only going to be offered in the public school. Well, that creates a major challenge in that it sucks all of the 3 and 4-year-olds away from that diverse mixed delivery market and places them in the preschool. Obviously, folks are interested in having a free service rather than one that they're paying for. And so the challenge is that those preschool or that those early learning providers, childcare providers in the community, when that cohort, they have to shift to serving just infants and toddlers, which is an extremely expensive thing to do. And you don't have the ability to shift from, maybe you don't have as many infants this year and you can shift that classroom to serve preschool kids and vice versa. You don't have that flexibility. And just serving, we know from experience, we know that serving infants and toddlers is an extremely expensive thing to do, and something that we have to really focus on making sure there is access in a market. So.
Absolutely. So, Rick, I would love to know what you sort of make of all of this. I think already what we've been chatting about here, if we think of the last conversation that we had about K-12 education, so many of this, it feels like we're almost in bizarro world, right? Some of the issues are different. We're trying to defend a sort of mixed model, where others are trying to create a mixed model. Like, how do you think about all of this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, and I think it's funny. we've started off on such a wonkish note. And it's weird, right? Because if there's anything you don't hear from the right about early childhood, usually it's wonkery. Mostly what you get is you get our friends on the left come up with big, industrial sized, really expensive things they throw out there. And then folks on the right either push back or say, well, we'll give you 50 cents on the dollar for what you're talking about. And I think that's where, you and I in the book, we talk about why it's so important to start with values. Look, the values in play here are conservatives, at least our kind of conservatives, right? We respect the heck out of the family. We think families ought to put all children, especially real little children, in settings that they feel good about, that reflect their aspirations and values. We want arrangements that are flexible. We're skeptical about big bureaucracies. We understand that working families, not all of whom are student loan forgiven lawyers and journalists and DEI trainers, but who may work the swing shift at Targets, don't really necessarily either want to put their 3-year-old on a bus and have them just out of sight for 7 hours, and don't want to drive 20 miles across town to stick their kid in something to then drive 20 miles to work. What's the alternative? Well, the alternative is not to embrace this kind of progressive model of pack 3- and 4-year-olds into elementary schools with unionized teachers with bachelor's degrees and run them on a 180-day school calendar, but to make sure families have the resources, the choices, the opportunities, the tools to put together the kinds of early childhood supports that suit their needs, that reflect their values, that let parents maintain that bond, that expose kids to loved ones. I mean, boy, the fact that conservatives are usually playing defense on this is the craziest thing in the world.
No, I'm so glad you brought that up because, I think you started to answer this question and I'd like to open it up for everyone else. But a kind of big picture before we dive into this, like, why should conservatives care about early childhood education? And maybe isn't an area where they've had as much action in the past as we've seen potentially engaging in K-12 and higher ed. Like, why should conservatives care about this?
I mean, I'll hop in quickly. Obviously, the governor represents all Virginians in the great Commonwealth. And so as he's been on the road talking to employers, talking to families, talking to community leaders, this has a ripple effect across the Commonwealth. And we have to be at the table with viable solutions and really thinking outside the box on what is going to best meet the needs of his constituents. So that's why it's a top priority initiative for Governor Youngkin.
And I would add on to that. I mean, I think, one reason conservatives should care about it, as Emily Ann said, is like constituents care about it. And they can care about it for a variety of reasons. Some it's because they do need the work support. Some is because they want some type of, preschool or, pre-K, some type of, programming before they enter the formal education system. Again, it doesn't matter, but it's that respecting, what they do want is respecting of the choice. The other reason I think at least we want to really care about, this is a place we need to care about the design of it, is that if we don't care about it, we're not going to have that choice that has been there for now 30 plus years and like longer outside of federal support, far longer, will be eviscerated. And the one thing I think, if we just did go to modern history of why and where choice not only matter, where it showed its ability to be responsive to parent needs, you don't need to look any further than COVID. Who shut their doors to parents and families during COVID? The public education system. Who didn't shut their doors? The private childcare system. They stayed open even before vaccines were available, still opening their doors to families because they understood the needs of families. They had to have a safe place for their child to go while they worked.
I was wondering if you all could help explain perhaps the politics of early childhood education, where the kind of fault lines are, because sometimes you can read some things out there from major kind of advocacy groups that will say, everyone's basically on the same page about this. It's unlike some of these other rancorous areas. the vibes, as the kids might say, that I'm getting from that is that is not in fact the case. But I would be curious of what you all think about this.
Mike, I'll take a quick, and I'm going to link a little bit to the previous question. The politics around this are oftentimes, that Celia's point, constituents care. They may care for a range of reasons, but they're interested. So when we look at polling on early childhood education, everyone overwhelmingly supports early childhood education. That doesn't mean that there's a monolith in early childhood education, right? And I think oftentimes interest groups can look at it and say, look, we're proven right. A public pre-K system, we absolutely need that because the system is quote unquote broken. That's what we tend to hear a lot. We need some massive investment in early childhood education. Not need it, but we don't necessarily need a major overhaul. We need an investment. And so when we think about the politics, it's really, do we need a major overhaul, or do we need to capitalize on the existing infrastructure that we have and enable parents to make the choice that most meets their needs? And so I think that we tend to see that divide. I think the growing interest from conservatives, or there should be one, is employers are focused on this. They're hearing it from their employees' perspective or current, that a lack of access to consistent quality childcare and early childhood education is impeding their ability to do their job well. And so when employers are seeing this as a major challenge for the local economy and for their workforce, then conservatives need to understand, how do we support employers, support the local economy, support small communities that may struggle to access or support an early childhood education? How do we have a perspective that's a conservative perspective that doesn't essentially just default to the public school system? That's where we need to invest.
I think from the federal politics of it, like at the staff level, Mike and others, look, where the fault lines really are. They became so evident in Build Back Better. Like in Patrick I had started on the last reauthorization of the Child Care Development Block Grant at one point, and then left, and Patrick and a few others, were there for the end. And like even through that debate, the Democrats, no one questioned that we were going to maintain choice. We even had an amendment accepted without any debate by Tim Scott that even better affirmed that choice was supposed to be there. And no one said boo. And then here comes Build Back Better. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, we kind of want choice, but we're going to like sprinkle in some words that eviscerate choice, particularly, for religious providers. And we don't really want threes and fours in this mixed delivery model anymore. We really want them over here in the public school setting. And I think the 3 and 4 debate has been where I think things have started to get muddled. And I think conservatives have been, I would say, have drifted, particularly some of the state levels, on that over time, because they have bought hook, line, and sinker. 2 studies, very old studies, both Mike and Rick go into good detail, I think, in your book on. They were good studies at the time, but we cannot take these like now ancient studies and say that 2 additional years of formal education, the earlier, is going to fix all of K-12, and that's what people are touting by putting it into the K-12 system. If I just add 2 more years on top of kindergarten, we haven't even proved kindergarten actually got a city bang for the buck, but if I add 2 more years, everyone's going to graduate from high school, they're going to go to college, and they're going to have this great job. And it's not to say that early childhood doesn't matter, but there's not this magical switch that goes off at 3 and 4 and says, hey, this community setting is no longer good, and it can only be over here in this unionized K-12 setting.
Yeah, Mike, one way to think about this is kind of, anytime you hear somebody say there's no political difference, you got to figure out, first you got to ask, what are they trying to sell you? Because that's just nonsense, right? We all want children, we all want 3 and 4-year-olds to be safe and loved and educated. We all want college to be affordable and actually used, but that doesn't actually tell you anything that matters. The North Star, I think, for our friends on the left over the last 5-10 years has become the monstrosity that Bill de Blasio built in New York City. What he did was he strapped, like Celia just said, a couple of grades onto the New York City Department of Public Education system that spends $38,000 a year per child and still can't find summer school slots for half the applicants and can't graduate half the students who attend. He strapped 2 grades onto that, which meant that your 3 and 4-year-olds now are getting transported, or you have to get them to these big industrial size public school buildings where they are taught on the public school calendar by unionized teachers, which means if union teachers aren't working, your early childhood care just disappeared, which means if schools are on break, your early childhood care just disappeared, which means summer vacation, your early childhood care just disappeared. You're on the school bell schedule, which means that if their early childhood day ends at 1 o'clock, your kid is out of there. Either that, or you've got to come up with money to pay for aftercare, or you've got to go pick up your kid. None of this has anything to do with the lived realities of lots of families. And one of, I think, the big difference is the conservative North Star, when you look at what like Emily Ann has led in Virginia, is conservatives, we're not part of this early childhood cartel. We don't have to worry about what the advocates and the funders have decided is right. We don't have to worry about offending the teacher unions or the bureaucrats. So we can say, wait a minute, what's it look like to design a system from the family out? And what families want is reliable, predictable, quality care that's there every day the parent works, not just the day the schools happen to be open. What they want is care which, if a parent needs to go get a sick child, if they get a call, that it's easier to get that child than not. The great thing about doing this in early childhood is whereas in K-12, we worry a lot about curricular scope and sequence, which means we cover material this day and then the next day and the next day. Early childhood's not organized like that. It's much more creative. It's much more free-flowing, so that if parents are working irregular work schedules or swing shifts, it's possible to put together co-located early childhood care that is still dynamic and rewarding and engaging. And this is the stuff that we can champion because we're not hidebound. We're not stuck working with hidebound systems or placating the interest groups. The shame of it is that too rarely have we seen conservatives, and especially conservative governors, actually choose to take this up as a challenge to lead on.
Mike, I also want to jump in here. So since this is obviously very timely here in the Commonwealth right now, you know, everyone here is pretty aligned on choices driven by parent demand. Again, public, private, home-based. It comes into who is eligible, what are the requirements on families, and who pays, where there seems to be tension and differences from political lenses. So first on who's eligible, other states have taken on universal approach. Here in the Commonwealth, we really have focused on our highest need working families. And like the federal child care subsidy program in Virginia, we do have requirements on families. We've added in attendance requirements for our youngest learners because we know our chronic absenteeism is through the roof, which is why we have our All in Virginia plan on the K-12 side. But starting our earliest learners around attendance, but also establishing consistent co-pays on a sliding scale for families to have buy-in, and also looking at those work requirements that mirror that federal subsidy program. And you would think that's not controversial, but that is where we have had some serious differences of opinions. And then thirdly, who pays? You know, a lot of other states have just taken on all of the cost of early learning options, and Governor Youngkin, through this building blocks plan, has really said this is a community solution that we need to come about. Local, state, federal, but also how do we incentivize employers, philanthropy, and others to come at the table? And so part of our building blocks plan is establishing early learning and childcare accounts that are housed in digital wallet platform, so that not only can you get sort of the state and federal targeted dollars towards our highest need working families, but that you also have an easier to navigate system for families. And that is not necessarily widely embraced, which we can unpack later if you want. But the goal is to make it as easy as possible to have multiple funding streams and sources to help cut down some of those costs and make it more accessible to others. And so for me, it's more the nuts and bolts rather than the concept at large.
Emily Ann, can you say, one of the things I've heard you talk about a bit is also your efforts to remove unhelpful impediments, which make it harder to, serve families and neighborhoods, to open new centers.
Yeah, and it's been exciting to see lawmakers take up these issues from zoning and permitting hurdles, especially on employers. We've got some bills on the governor's desk right now under review, to even background clearance. We kept hearing from the field background checks for early childcare teachers and educators is far more cumbersome than on the K-12 side, especially if you're switching providers. So just this week, the governor signed a bill, HB 508, that's trying to streamline, again, top priority, keep kids safe, but how do we also eliminate where there has been some of that bureaucratic creep so that we can make it easier for families to access options and easier for providers to scale. There's another area where we don't think a lot of, but the governor also signed a bill this week that's sort of streamlining those families that qualify for public assistance through Medicaid and other programs, that it's streamlined because Virginia's program is focused on our highest need working families. Like, how do we create more of a one-stop shop for ease while still making sure that we're helping those who need it most and are adhering to those work-based copays and other components based on income and work thresholds.
Emily Ann, you mentioned, and I'm glad because this is like something I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on, but you mentioned philanthropy, and obviously sort of in the specific case of being able to contribute to children's scholarship accounts. But I'm thinking maybe the question perhaps more broadly, which is like, what is the role of philanthropy in this? If we have, let's say, listening to this today, a conservative philanthropist, like, what advice would you all give them? How can they positively impact this field?
Okay, well, I would like to start. So those of you that know me from my prior role, was really jazzed on the K-12 side because you're funding unbundled learning spaces and innovation and cool new learning models. And there's a total void on the early childhood, especially infant to 5. And so I'm like shouting out to all of you that are paying attention. Because, Virginia has long used federal funds to innovate, try new approaches, and then prioritize once we have those proof points on what works, leveraging our state dollars. But being able to have philanthropic partners to come alongside us as we're working on this leading edge building blocks solution would really help us to more quickly deliver on our vision and also get those solid proof points to share with the General Assembly for long-term sustainability. And right now it is crickets. So we would love more folks that want to come and really seize on these education entrepreneurs that are also on the birth to 5 arena.
Yeah, I would follow up on Emily Ann because I think that is a critical place where philanthropy has a role to play in early ed. I mean, I think in the early ed space, and I'm not, no criticism to any of them out there who, but a lot of what they have funded has been to advocate for more money. And I'm not saying that more money, actually, particularly if it goes to a voucher program, is such a bad thing. I don't think it is. But there is so much more to make these systems better work for families and kids. And that's the ultimate, customer here, and we have to care about. And under the federal program, which has been really the kind of the block of money that most states have used, states have not really put in much money historically of their own. There hasn't been a lot of money to innovate or try something out. So like people have been hesitant to try something because they couldn't pilot it. So the only way they could try it is try it out on everyone statewide. And they're like, oh, what if it fails or not? And that's where I think, this philanthropy could be so great because there are a lot of places in this field that are tricky. Like, how do you do third shift? work that meets what parents want. Sometimes, you talk to, providers who said, yeah, we got into years ago thinking we were going to put a site on, a center on a third shift on a site. And guess what? Parents didn't come because we didn't really spend a lot of time talking to parents, because I think there's that old, also long-standing thing with parents: never wake a sleeping child. So you don't want to wake a sleeping child up to transport them somewhere else for care. But then how do we provide that care for, for those third shift workers who have to have that care? They can't leave that child at home.
I'd love to add on to this. I think where philanthropy would be phenomenal is just educating, back to Celia's point, the significant conservative win that we already are sitting on. We don't talk a lot about, but more and more as we are funding that from point focused on lower income families, voucher based, right? We are in choice from the start. Oftentimes, we're all report investments and funding the job grant more robust appropriations bill. On is need to
I'm sorry, Patrick, I think we may be having some technical difficulties with you. You've been kind of cutting in and out. I don't know if you can hear us, but
I can hear you just fine.
Well, now we can hear. We'll give it another go. No, you're good.
I think folks really should have listened to Celia.
Yeah, I think sorry, you're still kind of cut out. I'm sorry. I don't know if it may be the internet or the AirPods. I'm not 100% sure, but maybe we'll let it settle down. I'll ask another question. We'll let it settle down. We'll see what happens. And this is as good a segue as I'm going to get. We've been getting some audience questions. They are already fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and throw one out there now. I really appreciate it. So again, folks can email them to Alana. You can tweet them at the hashtag. The hashtag is gettingECE But the first question I want to throw out to all of you is a real simple one, just to get this started, which is one of the questions is, what is the purpose of early childhood education? And this is the questioner writes, my own assessment is that the purpose is to prepare children for kindergarten. Then the question becomes, what constitutes a kindergarten-ready child? Such a great question, and I think probably worth dwelling on for a minute. So the big picture question is sort of, what is the purpose of early childhood education?
I'll start. I think it starts with what parents want it to be. I mean, there could be mixed wants of what these first 5 years of a child's life are. I do think, even when parents start and say, when you dig deeper and they say it's just, start with work support. When you ask them, what are you looking for in a program? When they start describing that program to you, it's pretty clear it's more than just a place to plot my child during the day, particularly when you're spending a lot of bucks on this. You expect your child to be doing something other than sitting in front of the TV, and would be horrified if that's what they were doing. So when you start to, ask parents of it, even though they might lead with work support, they do expect them to be working with them on these, very developmental milestones as they go from, an infant up through, age 4. And the beauty is, I think, Rick alluded to with early childhood educators and the way the system is, it's not monolithic. It's not like everybody has to be at the same place every day. It acknowledges that children are developing on their own continuum and own time. And so you meet children where they are.
Yeah, I think, Mike, one way to think about it is, in the book, you and I talk about, one of the critical missions of K-12, say, is knowledge-based. One of the ways we measure whether it's doing its work well is it is developing the knowledge base, skills, and mastery of the students. That's not, as I see it, that's not the mission of early childhood. Early childhood is to help children reach those developmental goals that Celia just alluded to. It's to make sure that they are at least in a healthy place in terms of pre-literacy, so that when they get to kindergarten, they're in a place where they can work with teachers, that they have mastered kind of the contextual cues, colors, shapes, the kinds of pre-knowledge skills and capabilities that equip them to go into a learning environment. But I think the most important thing in early childhood, which is why kind of this industrial sized approach seems so wrong-headed, is that the most important thing is we want these children to feel safe and loved and centered and tied and coupled to their families, so that when they start to go off into that world in kindergarten, that they are going off from a strong and healthy foundation. This is why making sure there's lots of room for friends, family, and neighbor care, that our systems are respectful and supportive of that, is so critical. It's why neighborhood daycare, early childhood can be so powerful, because it makes it easier for families to make sure that they're not dropping off really little children for 8 or 10 hours at a stretch. Um, you know, I think so. We can talk about developmental stages, but I think what we really want is a sense of connection and safety and family. And unfortunately, that's what, as Celia mentioned, the Build Back Better model, that's what the de Blasio model, that's what not only do they not support, but I fear they actively erode.
Okay, I have another question that immediately goes to the top of the heap because it mentions my home state of Missouri in the fifth word. So maybe if you want to get your question to the top of the queue, maybe say go Chiefs or go Royals. God knows they need all the help that they can get. But it's also a very good question. So it's an audience question that says, I can only speak for Missouri, but we have many, many programs who have empty classrooms or entire empty buildings that are ready to have children, but they cannot hire staff to work in those classrooms. We've heard from higher education leaders that fewer students are enrolling in ECE programs because the degree does not lead to a wage that allows them to provide for themselves and their families. Therefore, we're losing well-qualified educators in the ECE field, and we know, for instance, that around half of ECE teachers in Missouri have zero qualifications. How would the panelists address the workforce issues unique to this field and ensure that all families have access to quality programs?
Well, if you want to do the Virginia way, stop requiring bachelor's degrees, because that is not research and evidence base for these early years, and it serves as an unnecessary barrier to entry for really high quality candidates. We have dynamite early learning teachers and educators that are working with our youngest learners, and that has very much helped us to attract additional high quality, talented leaders. We also have really supported grow your own efforts, not just at the K-12 level, but with those early learners. We have some great high school programs of Teachers of Tomorrow, where they're training as aspiring teachers, but also are helping to serve in those early learning spaces for teachers, say in the school division or in the community, and starting out in that early care provider space, or even continuing to work in that space as they continue to pursue additional educational certificates or goals. And so, looking at what are those barriers to entry, because they may not align with the skills, soft skills, expertise that's really a value add.
Emily Ann was, politic about this, because she's got to be. I don't have to be. I think there's a fundamental confusion about what college degrees are and what they signify. Somehow, over the last 30 or 50 years, we've gotten it in our heads that getting a college degree means somebody is better at certain kinds of tests. That is true sometimes. If I'm hiring an accountant I think an accountant who's majored in accounting is likely to know the rules and codicils much more effectively. When I am hiring people for lots of important work, to fix my car, to plunge our toilet, these things matter. The quality of the work matters immensely to me, but I could give two hoots about whether or not this person has got a college degree. The reality is that there's no evidence that majoring in, an education or these things makes you a better teacher, even in a knowledge-based K-12 setting. The idea that somehow spending a lot of money to chase a parchment degree, to spend time supporting and helping with children who, are pre-literate, the college degree matters to whether or not you're equipped to work with them, I think is just a fallacy. Are there particular roles and niches in early childhood where specialized training or a college degree makes a difference? Sure. We can think of special supports for children with special needs but the idea that for the run-of-the-mill early childhood worker, we want this to be a college-educated workforce strikes me as just a wildly misplaced sense of how important or how useful college degrees are for the kind of work we're talking about.
And I would add, I think under that point, when you talk to providers over the years, I've had the opportunity to do, and this is another thing that people have forgotten about often, it's been around for a long time. We actually have an industry recognized credential in early childhood that's been around for like 40 years, the CDA. And when you ask providers time and time again, they will tell you, my staff who have worked on a CDA, which is not a bachelor's degree, it's a pre-associate, but those are the staff who are best in their interactions, which is what is key to good quality in early childhood, is that interaction between adult and child, and they will take a CDA person any day over anybody with a bachelor's degree in that classroom.
I'm so glad you flagged that, Mike. Just one thing, because this is definitely on our Secretary of Labor's side here in the Commonwealth in regards to regional high demand pathways where we really are prioritizing those additional credentials and pathways and looking further at, barriers to entry, but it's on our jobs, high demand, regional based placements of what we really need for that next pipeline of young leaders.
This question clearly, hopefully my mic is working this time. I made some technical switches here. This is a really important question, and it's not just in Missouri. We're seeing it elsewhere. There are credentials. The CDA is a great one, right? That we want to make sure that folks in the classroom have the skills they need to be a great teacher, but also to be successful and stay in the classroom and make that a longer term commitment. We also have to make sure that families can afford care. And so that balance is really important. Rick, you talk about, kind of the bachelor for all type approach, right? That's all well and good. We just have to make sure that we can make sure that families can afford, once those classrooms are open, that they can afford to have their kid go to them. That balance is really challenging as well.
All right, we're getting more questions from the audience, and they're only getting better. So thank you so much for folks sending them in. So here's another one. I was going to say, high demand job. I don't know if it's going to be webinar moderator, because clearly these folks can do it without me. I can just read them off the cue cards. Okay, so here's the next one. Moving forward with early childhood, do you think a free market approach is the only accountability measure necessary for early childhood programs? If not, what additional accountability measures would you recommend?
I'll take a stab at that. I don't think that we have I don't think we really currently have a system that is purely free market, right? I do think that there are structures in place. Licensed childcare, want to make sure that we have a safe and healthy environment for early childhood education, infant through up through school. And I think those play a really important role in protecting the health and safety of kids and showing parents that those are the things that they should look to. I think that in the child care development block grant, something that Celia's led for a long time is quality rating and improvement systems, really emphasizing how are we measuring the quality of those systems. That is a bipartisan thing. It's something that we've reiterated and invested in over time, that quality matters and public dollars should fund quality. So I think choice matters. That doesn't mean that it's purely free market. I think that the free market is a great place to enable parents to make the choice that makes sense for them. But also there are structures in place to ensure that childcare and early learning settings are of high quality and are really prioritizing the health and safety of those young learners.
I would just add a little bit, because I think I'm in a slightly different place than where I was maybe 10 years ago on these quality rating systems. I mean, I definitely think they're important. I'll start, if you're going to do it, it definitely needs to be state and local. The feds don't need to touch it anywhere. You don't need to get anywhere near how we measure quality in this age group. But I think, I think COVID actually gave some states some breathing room a little bit on these quality rating systems. Because I think, well, they weren't able to do the assessments, but folks are now like reevaluating, like, what did we get out of it? A lot of them, unfortunately, the states, because they got all caught up in this teacher quality and a BA thing. I mean, you've got circles and number of squares you could go up in stars, but at the ultimate, where it ended up kind of getting you to be at that top was like, how many bachelor's degree teachers did I get? And so it's time, I think, to like really reevaluate that and get clear about, particularly with providers, what is it you ultimately, you all as a state and local community think, matters, and what's important, from the states to require, and what is kind of nice to be that should be up to a parent to decide whether they want to actually pay, to be honest, an upcharge of that service. Because, the more you add on to this, the more expensive everything becomes, particularly when you're talking about a sector that is so the margins are so thin because it is such a labor intensive enterprise.
I guess I would say, we really are measuring the impact of every public dollar. We want to be transparent for both taxpayers and families. And so we have statewide measurement and data systems measuring the quality in classrooms and settings who receive public dollars, which I think is important. However, there's also safety measures and metrics that some families care about more than necessarily the academic angle. And one of the things that I've spoken both with Rick and Mike before is just, we have also got to be better on parent navigator supports in this early childhood space. Certainly a few providers are starting to step up and lead, but we certainly are far away from sort of a niche great schools like the K-12 system has. And so as we are building out our digital wallet platform for families with our building blocks solution here in Virginia, a lot of that is to ease the kinds of things families want to sort for. And how do we account for what all those measures are, Mike, in regards to what signals the experience they want for an infant versus a 2-year-old versus that 3 or 4-year-old on the cusp of that sort of formative kindergarten years. So I think that's really critical. And so we're in the stages of starting to get family and parent impact, doing those focus groups to try to, how do you build those indicators that really are driven by family demand to get the match right as to the space that their own child will best thrive in.
Fantastic. Next question from the gallery. How do you go about conveying the importance of family and community to more libertarian-leaning conservatives who favor measures like deregulation and tax cuts as a solution to early childhood problems? It's a great question.
Yeah. Well, I think one, it's a lot easier than it used to be, just because of the shifting kind of the texture of conservatism in the U.S. That we're much more used to speaking in terms of communitarianism due to kind of the populist search. That's one. A second thing is like, look, there are some of these issues in a modern economy that just matter a lot. and they don't fit neatly to a libertarian's theoretical boxes. But the reality is, if you don't get an education, a quality education as a child today, you are going to have extraordinary challenges when it comes to being a responsible citizen, a caring family member, or a productive member of society. It's simply that the ante to get into the game as a citizen or productive member of society is different today than it was in 1924, 1824. And what we need is a conservatism that reflects the lived reality. Part of that lived reality is we need to be for terrific, high quality education that values merit, that honors kind of excellence, because that is what it takes to make sure that every American has a chance to pursue the American dream. But that doesn't start at age 6. That starts earlier. And so if you actually believe in what, Mike, you and I have described as kind of core tenets of our kind of conservatism, of the importance of autonomy, of personal responsibility, of the family, of the notion of working within a system of ordered liberty, you've got to be interested in finding ways that are practical and authentic to help make sure that kids are getting the supports they need to succeed. Ideally by supporting and strengthening families whenever possible, but also by providing those other opportunities. And if someone is such a diehard libertarian that they're like, nope, what was good enough for us in 1824 is still good enough for us in 2024. It's a free country, but I don't think that's much more than a tiny rump caucus. And I don't think those diehards are really where we want to focus. I think what we do want to focus on are those huge numbers of of time-strapped families, of sensible conservative legislators who haven't had anybody present them with useful, practical, kind of conservative ways to address these challenges, which has too often made it look like big, bureaucratic, kind of industrial strength, one-size-fits-all pre-K is the only solution in town, and they either have to jump on that train or they have to be just out of the game.
One thing we've used, Mike, is there was a recent study out of Vanderbilt on recognizing Virginia for our effective use of public dollars and showing that the investments we were making because of all of the things I've previously mentioned in childcare then are paying for themselves about a year later, and families are working more, earning more, stimulating our economy. And so that certainly resonated with a lot of our business groups, but also those looking at it more from that economic angle.
Yeah, and I will say, I think in the book, I think Rick, we call it the two-step. We're a bit critical of some of our libertarian-leaning and conservative confreres who would occasionally, when pressed, will be quite vociferous, and they're explaining all of the problems, many of the things that we've articulated already with the Build Back Better model, the 2 more years of K-12 model, but then said, okay, well, so what should we do about it? And then it's deregulation and tax cuts. It's like, well, if we need to just deregulate this field more, and that'll drive the cost down, and we need to cut people's taxes, and then they'll have the money to pay for it. And as we walk through in the book, where it's like there's certain fundamental realities, both of, unless you want robots watching kids or something, there are certain adult to child ratios that need to exist. And there are certain realities about how much people pay in taxes and others that you could cut huge swaths of people's taxes down to zero. And that delta still wouldn't pay for early childhood education.
People need to remember that even John Stuart Mill 200 years ago acknowledged that, yes, the state has a legitimate interest to make sure that kids are prepared to be responsible citizens, productive adults. And now J.S. Mill didn't want a public institution charged with doing this. He thought it was appropriate that families take responsibility. But even he said there's an appropriate role for public investment to make sure that all families can get their kids over that bar. So the idea that there's anything that violates kind of core tenets of individual liberty by saying that we want to make sure that we're working to help families find places where their little children are able to mature and develop into the kinds of young children who are ready for their responsibilities and to go to school. That's not a libertarianism that I find even consistent with the teachings of of Mill or Friedman.
I'll say just one last piece to that, right? Burying your head in the sand on this one doesn't work, right? We talked at the beginning about polling and the momentum around this, like that doesn't help, right? So building that perspective on it, rather, that's no place for us. Like actually, that's the voters are telling us that that's the place from a policy perspective, and so we can't abdicate that one.
So I may have just led us into a trap here, because there was a fantastic question that, as we were talking about this very thing, an audience question. So who's going to pay for this mixed model system so that it is affordable for families while paying educators a living wage? Right now, parents pay too much and educators make too little. Do conservatives agree that a major federal investment is needed? If not, how will this ever be affordable?
I mean, I think in the end, it's going to have to be funding coming from multiple sources. The feds have been historically the largest funder in this space. I mean, if I had to prioritize funding, this is just Celia Sims talking. If I'm going to say I've got to prioritize, federal dollars in the labor H bill, I'd be more than glad to take from a lot of programs in labor H and shift them over to CCDBG, which is a parent choice model. Then a bunch of the stuff we're spending into, non-choice models with all of, ESEA and HEA all wrapped in on that. But it is a conundrum on the how the educator, pay piece, because it is the largest expense for providers, because it is labor intensive, and there's only so much you can cut on that before you have impaired, health and safety of young children. But again, I think trying to keep some of the mission creep, some of the like really crazy regulations that don't have anything to do out, not going down this rabbit hole of bachelor's degrees. And certainly one way to you want to keep costs down, don't abdicate all the 3s and 4s to the public school setting, because maybe it's going to look like you're saving on early childhood, but watch your K-12 budgets explode at the state level by adding 2 more grades.
Yeah, I think so. Just building on what Celia said, look, I mean, if we are busy bankrupting this country in order to subsidize seniors, I sure as hell don't think we ought to balance it on the back of 3 and 4-year-olds by nickel and diming. So sure, there is absolutely an appropriate role for more state money, for more federal money to support early childhood. I can live with that, but it depends enormously how those dollars are funneled, like Celia just said, the program construction. I mean, Build Back Better. The White House and the Democrats on Capitol Hill very deliberately said, heck with you guys, to conservatives when they chose to go with basically, the de Blasio model. That's a non-starter. No, I'm not for another penny, if that's what we're talking about. But if we're talking about something that reflects, the parameters that we've been talking about, sure, I'm absolutely comfortable with more investment. I also think we ought to spend a lot more time and energy talking about how do we encourage and support employers to approach this, changing tax code, changing tax treatment of early childhood, because having early childhood care, co-located to a working environment is a fantastic boon for parents in all kinds of ways. So that's absolutely something we ought to encourage. And look, the payment question, like we've talked about, I think, one of the things we're doing is we are creating labor shortages in early childhood because of our regulatory approach, because of the credentialing approach. But sure, it would be swell to see these folks earn more money. And there's certainly plenty of states and communities where I agree with the question that the wages are earning don't seem adequate to what we're trying to get. And yes, more public investment and encouraging more employer investment is part of addressing those pay issues, seems healthy and appropriate.
And one of the roles we've taken on is trying to create the infrastructure to make it as easy as possible, right? To drive multiple revenue streams in and make it as easy as possible for providers on the back end. We're pursuing the digital wallet approach, but how do you create that one-stop ease for both sides, right? For the household, for employers, when they do have someone, in our case, with an infant to 5 on their payroll, can we make it as easy as possible to make a contribution? For family members to make a contribution, we looked a lot to 529 plans, and like, how can we learn from sort of other pathways and apply it into the early childhood space?
All right, I'm going to ask one last audience question here. In the book, you discuss the insufficiency of available evidence that is widely cited among proponents of universal pre-K, but you ultimately believe that early learning and childcare are important. When you examine successful, small-scale, privatized pre-K systems that work better than a universal system, what aspects of children's development reveal this system's success?
Well, since we wrote the book, I'll answer this one. Honestly, in the book, I think we're real clear that we don't, we're not comfortable pointing to specific successes. For instance, the Tennessee, the randomized control trial that we've seen playing out over the last 14 years in Tennessee has actually found that their Head Start seems to have had, in a gold standard research study, substantial negative results for many of the participants for reasons that we're still trying to wrap our minds around. And reasonable people can read these results. It's like, but there's certainly nothing positive there. When it comes to small scale private environments, you don't get much in the way of high quality of research, except for kind of maybe Abecedarian or Perry from, 50 plus years ago. But look, I think you and I, our stance is we don't need large scale studies to be convinced that making sure little children are in safe, loving, enriching, dynamic environments is a good thing. Like there's a lot of things as a conservative. One of the pluses is you don't need to find some technocrat to prove to you the obvious. So we kind of take that as a sensible place. In many cases, that means being home with a parent or some other kind of in-house care. It can mean being somewhere with a grandparent or relative or a neighbor, but it can also mean lots of these environments. What defines the good ones? Bob Pianta at University of Virginia has done some really good work in terms of what like Celia and Emily Ann were talking about before, in terms of some of the kinds of metrics you can look at. It's about the interaction between the kids and adults. It's about, are we talking about an environment where there are lots of things to interact with, lots of manipulables, lots of stations, or are kids plunked somewhere kind of staring at a wall or, God forbid, a TV or a device all day? Not a lot of rocket science here. And unfortunately, the childhood research community generally seems so intently focused on trying to come up with bureaucratic solutions and evaluating large scale efforts in order to convince us that we need to spend a lot of money on those, that this kind of nuanced, let's really get inside these things and look at what makes a living room a good living room for a 2-year-old or a 4-year-old is just not something on which there's been a lot of high quality research.
There was one, I'll ask my last question before I give everybody a chance to kind of go around the horn with some summative thoughts. But, Rick, you brought this up, and I think it's worth lingering on for a moment, but the sort of workplace-based early ed childcare things. We did kind of a drive-by of it, but I think it's worth lingering for at least another moment, because I know other folks on the call would have some thoughts about that. What is the kind of opportunity there? What can be done? How can that be used to help solve some of these problems?
I think that
you go ahead. Go ahead, Patrick.
So I'd say there are a number of ways, right? We're seeing some innovation in a number of states where we're looking at employers coming to the table, the government, the parent, and finding ways to share that burden. I think recognizing that link that folks are choosing childcare or an early learning setting because they're a working family. And So that linkage, I think, particularly during COVID, became more clear to employers that they had a role, or that early childhood impacted their business and continues to do so. So there's an openness now to, all right, how do we think about that? How do we work on making childcare more affordable, be it through tax credits, be it through business tax credits for investing in childcare, or maybe taking on the entire burden and building a childcare center. That's not for most employers in the country, but recognizing there is that role. And so thinking about childcare really as an investment in the workforce, as a benefit, we're seeing more employers think about their role there and how they use that as a recruitment and a retention tool. We're seeing it in rural and smaller communities, saying, how do we keep our workforce, or how do we bring a workforce to this community? And a lot of the reasons they're investing in childcare is because they're seeing that impact. And so there's not one way for employers to invest in childcare. There are a number of ways.
Yeah, I think it was a critical point that Patrick said. I mean, there's not one way. I mean, often the mantra is, oh, it's a like on-site center, and that will work for some employers, particularly on your headquarters site, but it's not going to work for your dispersed workforce that you've got multiple locations. So then it's your partnerships that you come up with, those community providers. And I'm really excited. Some of the work it sounds like Emily Ann is doing in Virginia is often like, how do employers support their employees knowing what may or may not be available, and particularly for folks who work, whether it's late shift or weekends, that's places where you can work with the resource and referral agencies and get them, hooked in together to find what it is. But there's a critical role to play, but it's important that there's not just one way. And just like we want childcare that meets individual child and parent needs, we need to be looking at employers to meet what their needs are and the needs of their particular employees.
Well, fantastic. I just would like to give maybe everybody one chance for a kind of summative comment, just maybe a minute or two from this. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I can tell I'm so thankful to our wonderful audience who's been throwing in such great questions, but just that kind of wrap up takeaway you want folks to leave with. Emily Ann, I think you had unmuted yourself like you were going to say something on that. So if that's what it is, that's fantastic, but I'll give you the first shot at it.
Well, I was going to say something about workforce, but I can include it now in my brilliant closing remarks. So I think the other part that we need to be cognizant of are who our parents are, proud millennial, and we just have a difference in what should be included in our HR benefits, right? And so talking to a lot of employers here in Virginia, they're like, it's just expected for this new generation coming into the workforce that we have more creative solutions, including like on-site spaces for our youngest learners, and that is something that maybe you haven't had to think about before. But I'm really proud Virginia is leading on this with a best-in-class model for our early learners, but we also need thought partnership. And so I'm so excited that you both have written this book and also are leaning in and challenging more thought partners to look at innovation and look at solutions and what's scalable from both higher ed, industry, K-12, because I went to Rick early on and said, this is top of mind for the governor and we need thought partnership. And I think he gave me 3 names. So I'm so grateful for those 3 names, but we need more folks at the table that are really rolling up their sleeves and trying to navigate this so we can get a sustainable and vibrant set of options for every household who wants it.
Fantastic. Patrick.
Like Emily, I've really enjoyed the conversation today. I appreciate y'all bringing us together to have it. And it sounds like we've got a robust audience that is interested as well. What I'll say in summary, a lot of what we talked about today was how the policy that we develop actually aligns with families and the decisions that they're making. And so, from a conservative standpoint, thinking about how do we enable families to work and to make the choices that they need, and then all the benefits, Rick, that you shared about the broader investment in early childhood and the future leaders and citizens that we're growing here. I think the great thing about this space is the foundation is one that is bipartisan. I think there's a broad interest in it, and I think that while there are some ideas that may not be palatable on the right, I think the core of the early childhood investment is one that is a conservative one. It is a family focused one, and one that I think that we should focus on building upon going forward.
Great. Celia.
Yeah, I'm so excited to finally have this conversation. I think I've said this to Rick before, but like when I started working on early childhood on the Hill in like 2008, I mean, we could have put the Republican early childhood folks in a phone booth because it was me. I found one friend on the House side, but still, we would have fit in a phone booth together. And it's been a very small group of people, and we need more, folks, allies on it. I remember when I turned to this program or CCDBG back in the day after doing years of K-12 policy, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's a voucher program. It's so exciting, and it works, and we should be for this. And Patrick, we've got a really good base here, and it meets our values, and we need more people at the table understanding what we have, the beauty of programs we currently have, and why we want to not just protect them but enhance them, because that's what our families want, and that's what those families' children need and want as well. So thanks for the opportunity to be here today, bringing us together. May there be many, many more with larger tables as we go along.
Rick, my friend, if you'd like to bring us home.
Sure. One small point and then one bigger point. Small point on the employer piece. One of the things to keep in mind is it never made a lot of sense for healthcare to be attached to employer, because when you leave your employer, you lose your healthcare. And that's a big problem. And that attachment happened during World War II, because under price controls, it was a way, blah, blah, blah. And it's good that we're not crazy about the Affordable Care Act, but it's good in principle that we have been seeking ways to attenuate. But you know what actually does make a lot of sense to have linked to your employer? Your early child care. Because if you're working at a site, being able to just take your child there makes parents' commutes enormously easier, makes pickup easier, makes it easier to deal with a sick child or deal with a doctor's appointment. And if you change employers, you want that to change with you. So that's not a problem. And to Celia's point, if you're working in a dispersed or virtual environment, that's fine. Employers can still, but we actually have, between regs and tax treatment and the rest, have not incentivized employers to provide early childhood the same way we used to encourage them to provide healthcare, and in many cases still do. So that's just a huge opportunity on the policy side. But more generally, as I think, as Patrick and Emily Ann and Celia have said, we just need conservatives to get in the game here. I mean, we've got governors who are doing remarkable things on educational choice in K-12. We've got governors who have finally woken up to the challenges in higher ed and are stepping up. We've got governors who are doing terrific stuff on the science of reading. Well, guess what? Here is a huge opportunity that touches families very immediately, to which our friends on the left are offering really expensive, really inhumane, really industrial-sized solutions, partly because they are so constrained. Even our really thoughtful friends on the left are so constrained by alliances and politics and the cartel. We're free to build, we're free to work, we're free to expand on so much that's already in place. This is the opportunity for philanthropists and governors and kind of just engaged kind of conservative education advocates to really up our game. And let's try to make it so that, next time Celia looks for that phone booth, it's like, there's 300 people spilling out of it all over. Like, that's where we ought to be at. And I think it's just a remarkable opportunity. And that's one reason why I'm so pleased with what Emily Ann and Governor Youngkin's team have done in Virginia, because I think they've really done a lot of the spade work of offering a model that lots of other governors can kind of start from and then shape in a way that suits their own state and their own circumstances.
Very well put. I'd just like to close with 3 brief housekeeping notes. The first is a note of tremendous gratitude Thank you so much to our fantastic panelists that we had. So insightful, really appreciated the conversation. Thank you so much for the team at AEI, particularly Alana Oventhal, who helped organize everything, but the great events team that AEI has that makes all of this stuff. They're the best in the biz. And I'm so grateful for everything that they did to put this on today. The second is to remind you of the book discount. Again, if you go to the Teachers College Press discount page, ABC, always be closing. Look, we're doing this. Head to the Teachers College Press website. If this has made you want to read the book more, which I can't imagine how it hasn't, so I know you'll be firing over there now. Enter the code AEI and you get a 20% discount. Again, the full title of the book is Getting Education Right, A Conservative Vision for Improving Early Childhood, K-12, and College. And then finally, the third point, please join us for our next Getting Education Right webinar in the series entitled Getting Higher Education Right. Same time, same place on May 1st. We'll have another terrific panel put together, and I'm really looking forward to that conversation as well. It was great talking with y'all. God bless. Have a great rest of your day.